Welcome to Norse Code, the #1 podcast for your Minnesota Vikings. I am your host and producer. I am James Pagoshnik. Thank you so much for listening. And on the other end of the tin can and string, I'd like to bring in our analyst. He is a writer for not just the Daily Norseman, but many, many blogs across the internets. We'd like to bring in our analyst, Arif Hassan. Arif, how are you doing today?
I'm good. How are you?
I am doing fantastic. What a weekend. That was fun. The Vikings game was fun. I ended up going to a Minnesota Wild game shortly thereafter, where the Wild ended up playing against the Winnipeg Jets B squad, so they ended up winning 8-1, which I gotta tell you was the most relaxed atmosphere on the planet compared to the Vikings game. It's like the Vikings game, everybody super charged up, ready to go. The hockey game was just, we're just relaxing. It's a hockey preseason game. There's air conditioning. We're good. Like,
it was a good move for you to move from the hot outdoors to the cold indoors for sure.
Yeah, it was very, very warm at the game this weekend. It was like, I was looking at the thing. It's like, it's going to be like 75, 76. We're going to be great. We're out there like, it's going to be closer to 90. All right, well, we'll see if Arif gets a tan, and we'll see like how many layers it will, how many like layers you can wear without dying.
Yeah, no, I ended up making some pretty poor choices in terms of my health. Because I'm a small dude, and so all of my jerseys are far too big on me, and I've got this Allen Page jersey. I absolutely love it. I try to wear it as often as possible to games and whatnot. But I look absolutely ridiculous in it if I don't have something underneath it, like a sweatshirt or something. And it can't just be a regular like t-shirt, because that doesn't bulk me up artificially like a sweatshirt does. So I decided to wear it. I was like, it's 60 degrees outside right now as I walked out, so maybe this will work out. It went all the way up to 80 or something, so it did not work out. But people kept buying me beer, so I found a way to cool down.
Yeah, as it turns out, our listeners love to buy Arif beer, and Arif is very happy to take that. So that's a positive. I feel like we learned something this weekend. So the game was awesome, and we're going to get into that really quickly. However, I would like to just point out a couple things before we begin. I had made an impassioned speech last weekend about kind of not save our Norse code, but just if you guys could help out, we'd really appreciate it. We were running low on server space and needed to do an upgrade for our hosting service anyway, and we were able to do that successfully. We do have a few donors that we would like to thank specifically for that. We'd like to thank Matt Murphy and Eric Olson and Nathan Schetzel and Ann Burmaster specifically. Thank you so much for going in, and those were through PayPal. Thank you so much. We really do appreciate that. Just trying to keep the lights on, and we have a new Patreon donor this week, John Mulaney, and not the same John Mulaney who wrote the Salt and Pepper Diner comedy sketch, or the guy who writes the Stefan stuff for Saturday Night Live, as far as we know. But this John Mulaney did, in fact, go and put up a thing for Tree-fitty, much like the Loch Ness Monster. So I just wanted to point out that all three of us had a really good laugh at the fact that we were getting Tree-fitty for that, and that's really all it would end up taking. Tree-fitty goes a long way for server space. You would be surprised. But again, we just wanted to thank you for that. Also, thank you for the laugh. That was really good. And if you would like,
that was quite good.
Yeah, that was great actually. It's like, well, we may actually have to discuss whether or not Arif or myself are in fact the Loch Ness Monster, whether or not we are a 6-story creature from the Mesozoic era, as Chef's parents would say. But again, thank you so much. If you'd like to donate to the show to help us keep going through the season, you can do so at NorseCodePodcast.com. There's a link at the very bottom of the page, and click donate. You can also go to our Patreon page, which is also posted there. You can also check it out at the Daily Norseman page, where we'll have our show up here very shortly. You imagine you're most likely listening to it on the Daily Norseman page, so go ahead, scroll down a little bit. Not quite to the comments section, but go ahead and look at the show notes, and there should be the link right there. Again, we do this so that you do not have to endure endless ads and endless interruptions about MeUndies or Christian Mingle or Farmers Only, which is apparently a thing, or there's a mattress one that's going around now. There's some like, it's not Denver mattress, but some like weird mattress ad that keeps getting played on certain shows, or any of the FanDuel stuff, or any of the DraftKings ads. So.
Now I'm intrigued by this mattress ad.
I'm trying to remember which show I heard it on, but I was just sitting there just going, really? You're advertising mattresses on a podcast? And after watching the second episode, listening to the second episode from them, like, oh, you're doing it again. All
That's
right.
frankly incredible. Do they think they can sell mattresses via podcast advertisements? Or, like, are there typical listeners, like, people who, like, really just need a good night's rest?
I don't know necessarily what it is, but like that can't be based directly on like using the code for like a website or something, right? Like that has to be like, because most podcast advertisements are like code based. So like if you went to like stamps.com with Bill Simmons, for example, it would be like enter in code BS for free blah, and that's how they know that they used it. They can track it and they can give the money or the referral to Bill Simmons. But with like a mattress thing, who the hell buys a mattress through an ad through a podcast? Like, that just doesn't seem right.
Especially if you're in the right geographic area and you were in the market for a mattress. Like, definitely if I heard an ad for a mattress in a podcast, that would stick with me much more than the advertisements I tend to skip on TV. So I guess if I'm in the area, I need a mattress, I would think about them. And I don't know, what... if you break down it's like the Drake equation, right? Like all the percentages for finding, sentient life in the universe, all of those percentages that you need are all super small. But the thing with the Drake equation is that when you select a portion of the sky or a portion of space, that contains a lot of planets, so that evens out all of these tiny percentages. I think that here the percentages are really small for, well, they're listening to the podcast and they need a mattress, and because they need a mattress, which I think that alone is a pretty small percentage. The first place they think of, because of your ad, is you. Those two percentages, I think, are small enough that I don't think the whole audience of the podcast is enough to make up for in order to get you the one buy. So that's interesting to me.
Yep, selling mattresses on a podcast. That is something we will try not to do. And thanks to these donations, we will not have to do that for some time. So again, thank you so much. So... we watched the game this weekend. That was awesome. I hadn't actually watched a game with you prior to this weekend. That was pretty cool, and there were a couple of real cool things from that we had seen anyway at the game. If you were watching the game and watching a bit of the halftime show, you would have seen the unveiling of the bust and the ring ceremony for Mick Tingelhoff. All of the Hall of Fame guys ended up hanging out by, like, in front of our section. We ended up, like, in the second row. So they were all hanging out in front of our section. So, like, nearly every Viking, like, Hall of Famer was just, like, inches from us. And we were just like, wow, that's kind of cool. And then
that's neat.
That's nifty. Wow, hey, there's Ziggy Wolf. Ziggy Wolf's outfit, his suit, so much better tailored than Rick Spielman's.
That's kind of stunning. We noticed that a couple of times in the game when Rick Spielman was walking around. That it feels like he's wearing his brother's suit. And by his brother, I don't mean like a generic abstract, but I mean Chris Spielman, Hall of Fame linebacker, because that dude is definitely taller than Rick. And Rick's suit was so ill-fitting, and it was so clearly for a taller person. I can't believe he wore it to a game, especially because like he clearly has the money to buy a suit.
It just struck me as odd as, wow, that's a big jacket. He's just really trying to hide the guns today or something. Like I don't know what's going on, but I was like, wow, that's kind of cool. But as we were watching and taking pictures, some of the fans were trying to lean over and get pictures or ask the guys to sign stuff. I don't think anyone signed anything, but the best interaction was this annoying guy in a Chargers outfit that had been just yelling stuff at our like section the whole time, or Adrian beats his kid, like just that sort of thing. Um, he kept going over to the side and asking Fran Tarkington to sign his Chargers hat.
It was incredible. Also, so
Of
you knew
all
this
things,
guy.
really?
Yeah, you knew this guy was an idiot and a douchebag right away because he was actually wearing two Chargers caps, one backwards on top of a forwards Chargers cap, two different colors,
Come
powder
on,
blue and then the
man.
dark blue. And just everything he was wearing was like kind of ridiculous. Which, I mean, let's be clear. There's another Chargers fan who was directly in front of us, who was a super awesome guy. We talked to him the entire game. But this dude, and he had his kid with him. This dude was such a jackass.
Yeah, and it's not just one of those like we're giving the recap of the game as far as we sat next to a Chargers game who was a douchebag, and thus this we're gonna just sit and pick on him for a second. That's actually not why I'm bringing it up. I'm actually bringing it up because he got kicked out of the game, not for yelling, he beats his kids, or not for yelling, hey, you guys realize after we scored, hey, you guys realize that it's gonna be winter here like next week, right? Which I think that actually incensed the crowd more than the Adrian thing. Like, you can make fun of our team and you can make fun of our running back all you want, but if you're gonna mess with our winners, dude, go to hell. um, but we bring it up because he had his kid with, and he got kicked out, and the kid was pleading and pleading to stay and watch the game and pleading for like one more chance, and the police ended up saying no because the guy was drunk. But like, as a visiting fan, like, or even not even as a visiting fan, as a home fan, if you're bringing your kid to a game, shouldn't you be upholding some like sort of standard to yourself? Like, and speaking as a parent, and I hate people who use that phrase, by the way, but speaking as a parent, like, I just can't imagine disappointing your kid, or like that look that the kid's gonna give you for the next like 3 weeks until they forget about it, about what you did at the game to get them kicked out. Like, kids are constantly watching it. It's really part of it's really annoying, but part of it's kind of cool that they're constantly watching and constantly like either trying to please you or trying to like emulate you. And so if you're sitting and doing that in the middle of a big area and like ruining the kids' opportunity to see a game, and they're San Diego Chargers fans. It's not like the Chargers play the Vikings that often. So if they flew there to watch the game, that's even worse. But if they were like,
I doubt they flew all
well,
the way to. I mean, they were in some pretty good seats, so
yeah.
it's possible.
But like
But
if they were just
man,
like regular like fans, like they live in like Hopkins or something, and they went to the game, and it's their one chance in X number of years to see the Chargers play the Vikings at home. Like, dude, come on. What a stupid way to ruin an otherwise great afternoon with your kid. And that
yeah,
is my
no, he screwed up.
that's my soapbox. I wanted to bring that up. I was like, dude, come on. What the hell? Um, it was kind of funny when you were trying to get Fran Tarkington to sign your hat, but everything else that ended up happening with you was just stupid.
No, for sure.
So, ignoring that and getting past that, what a fun game to go to. The Vikings win. The Vikings just destroy the Chargers. I'm fairly confident the Chargers don't have a starting offensive line anymore. I'm pretty sure they're just going through like the CFL and anybody on the waiver wire at this point. Like, what a great game for the Vikings, and our offense definitely showed up with Adrian.
Yeah, no, it was. I mean, there were a couple of things that obviously bounced the Vikings' way, including, unfortunately, a number of injuries to the Chargers, who of course had to, pick that kid out of the stands and have him play. But yeah, no, I mean, there was also just some genuinely good play from a number of players, mostly on the defense, but also in the offense, including Adrian Peterson, that made the game not just a dominant Vikings win, but also just genuinely just really fun to watch.
Yep, and the fun thing about the game is that Adrian got 126 yards and finally got back into the end zone. He got two touchdowns, and what was reported earlier that morning is that Adrian had a kid that day. And now I know you're wondering how many kids does he have, and at this point, I don't even know if he necessarily knows. But you can't bet against a guy who has a kid that morning. It's just not a wise thing to do.
Yeah, it's like the exact same thing as a father dying. That player's just going to go off.
Yeah,
Yeah.
it's the Favre thing. Like you don't do it. It's not a wise thing to do. Especially if you're playing against him in fantasy, you should probably just go home.
Oh my God, I almost got so because I played. So I made fun of Vincent Frank, who was actually the guest on the show in our San Francisco preview. I made fun of him because he constructed a really bad Thursday night lineup, including both Washington running backs, which was kind of silly. Made even more silly by the fact that a third Washington running back ended up with the most fantasy points on FanDuel. He ended up selecting both of those running backs in FanDuel, and none of the Giants running backs, like let's say Rashad Jennings, on a Thursday night game. And so I made fun of him, and I was like, "You're probably pretty easy to beat at FanDuel. Let's go." And so we started a $25 head to head, and this dude had the gall to start Adrian Peterson against me on my birthday. My team. I was just so incensed, but he also had the good grace to start his player Vernon Davis, who ended up, I believe, with 0 points. So at least I ended up winning that game. But I just thought that was very rude.
Why you gotta be so rude, dude? Come on.
So rude.
But Adrian Peterson, despite having a terrible week one, is leading the league in rushing. How about that? He got
Yeah,
100.
he's leading the league in rushing, and it's not just a total number of attempts thing. He also has like 4.9 yards a carry.
Yep, sure does. Adrian had 126 yards this week, 2 touchdowns. Could have been 3, but we'll talk about that in a moment. And finally broke off one of his "Oh my God, Adrian is loose" runs. What a sweet run.
Yeah, no, it was really fun to see, especially because it included like a bunch of different elements we've seen from different great Adrian runs. I mean, that includes his ability to improvise to the line of scrimmage. I mean, he didn't just follow his blocking and have the people create yards for him. He was able to improvise a little bit. He was able to use his agility. He was able to use his speed. And he was able to use his power, all to add yardage. And it was just some pretty vintage Adrian Peterson. We haven't seen it in a while, and it was just a good reminder of what the Vikings missed last year and why the Vikings were so excited to have Adrian and why fans are excited to have Adrian because he can pull off runs exactly like that, and it's just impressive. There's not like a better, more awe-inspiring word.
No, that was one of those Hall of Fame runs. One of those that you just feel like is going to end up. Well, that's the thing. He has so many of them now, and we got used to them after a number of years. But like that felt like one of those. It'll be on his Hall of Fame tape. Runs like just tosses a guy aside, breaks through. It's clear that he's working for every single yard. Like that was an awesome run for Adrian, and good on him. He ended up making it into the end zone twice, and I wouldn't say silence the critics or anything, but he even said himself he's back. He came in on his day off this week and just was like, I need to get in. I'm not feeling right. I'm not feeling it. Let's go, and it looks like some of the hard work is starting to pay off.
Yeah, for sure. And there's even a conversation between him and perhaps the star on the other side of the ball. We'll talk about a little bit more in depth in a second. But Chad Greenway, he and Chad had a conversation, in the previous week, where I mean they've been on the same team together for 9 years now, 8 years or something like that, and in the conversation that they're having, they have the ability to be pretty frank with each other, pretty honest with each other. And it's a really good story actually. I think it's in the Star Tribune. I'll link it in the show notes. But Chad mentioned to Adrian, hey, you're looking slower. You're not looking yourself. You're looking old. And there's not many people who have the credibility to sort of say that thing. Adrian,
I fear for the man's hand who does say that. Because in case you have forgotten through and not watched any broadcasts, everyone likes to bring up the fact that Adrian can kill you with his hands.
right. If you haven't if you haven't heard this,
If this
then
is new,
welcome to being a Vikings
yeah,
fan, I
if this is
guess.
new, he can crush your hands.
But yeah, so the story is that Chad mentions this to Adrian. Adrian, who already agrees with this based off of what he felt like in the last game, he does a bunch of conditioning over the course of the week. 18 100-yard wind sprints, I guess. Mike Zimmer said that, or Adrian said that, or something. In one practice, which I just threw up thinking about it. And yeah, I mean, I don't know if that conversation or Adrian's internal drive, and we talk about how he has an unmatched internal drive, or any number of things, or a combination of things, did it. But it is kind of cool that the two veterans that were probably the easiest to criticize, including for me, I think everybody listening to this podcast knows that, had astonishing games that maybe even impacted each other. But Adrian was just fun to see. Maybe we won't even see it by the end of the season, but for now, this is who he is, and that's pretty cool.
So he could have had a third touchdown, but instead, as he was lining up and the stadium was chanting AP AP, everyone's just freaking out, going, "He's gonna get his third! It's gonna be his third!" I look over at Arif and go, "Nope, this is Zach Line time. This is going right to Zach Line." And Zach Line goes in, and I damn near have a heart attack.
That was a pretty incredible moment. I think both in terms of like the weird stadium reaction, which I guess it makes sense because like if you're an offensive coordinator and the entire stadium is chanting for one player who almost got into the end zone on the previous play to get the ball, there's at least some chance that the opposing defense is also going to suspect that's a thing. They've already attempted the fullback dive in the preseason for a touchdown, so I guess that's what you do. And it made sense. It was a pretty hilarious moment because the area around us thought it was kind of funny. They kind of heard it, and I guess screw Adrian Peterson fantasy points. Hooray, Adrian Peterson real life performance.
Exactly. All Zach Line does is score touchdowns. That's all he has done this year. He is excellence personified. I actually just want to see a T-shirt that says Zach Line excellence personified or something like that. Like, dude's magic on the line right now, and I think that it's if he's doing this well from the 1, I feel like we should test him from the 2 and the 3 now. I feel like
We'll graduate him to theoretically longer runs.
Exactly. We'll let him. We'll roll the dice a little bit and let him test it from the 2 or the 3 now, and just see if we can push the pile just a little bit more for him. But good for Zach Line for getting another touchdown. I feel like I might have been the only person in the stadium that was truly happy for him. Like, everybody's happy for the score, but like, like truly happy that ended up happening. But yeah, good on Zach Line. Moving on to Teddy though. Teddy didn't have a great game. I ended up going 13 for 24 for 121 yards, 1 pick. Despite all of this, we still scored 31 points. So it's not like it was necessary for him to have some Aaron Rodgers huge day where he has to pass for 300, 400 yards or anything. But we are kind of at a weird point with him because there's a lot of anger at Teddy after the Chargers game, which myself and other people don't necessarily get. Why is there so much anger right now toward Teddy Bridgewater in this game?
I don't know. That actually I have no understanding of why. It surprised me when I checked the Daily Norseman comments section. Skull Troll actually has a really good Skull Troll. Used to be often commenter on the Daily Norseman pages. Returned after sort of months of not being there to basically chastise everyone in the fan post section. And I kind of agree with him that it was kind of weird to see all this Teddy hatred, people comparing him to Ponder. And I don't know, it was really unusual because I didn't expect it. I didn't feel it. I didn't see it. And then I come home and I go to Twitter, I go to the comment section, I go to a forum, I go to Reddit, and I see a lot of anger at Teddy. Now the people who are tweeting at me, a lot of my followers, they don't seem to be as angry, more as concerned, and they ask me, if I'm concerned, if there's reasons for concern. And I think before I answer that question, which I think is a pretty good question to answer, I'm going to talk about I think Teddy's game was unique for Teddy because he is typically a pretty low variance player. You could call him a game manager, but I think that you'd want to do that as a way of complimenting him instead of as a way of insulting him, like you do with Alex Smith. He tends to be an efficient passer. The Vikings don't tend to rely on him to be a volume passer until they're in a situation where they need to, which happened a couple of times last year. And and there are some issues with Teddy. I mean, I think that we saw that Teddy had this issue in the preseason. We saw it in this game where he was too willing to throw short of the sticks on third down, too willing to accept check down. So that's obviously a problem. But I think that there were two different Teddys in the game, and I think that the Teddy that was bad was the one that got a lot more attention than the Teddy that was good. There was not really a Teddy Bridgewater that we saw that was like the kind of average quarterback we saw midway through last year before he went on that 5-game run. There's just not a lot of instances of that. And, mind you, I watched the whole game live, not only watched half of it on the recorded broadcast. I'm taking, some pretty extensive notes. Hopefully I'll put them up later, to that end. But, after watching the first half of the game, there's clearly two different Teddy Bridgewaters. I think, you take a look at that interception. It was a very poor throw. I think, Charles Johnson could take a small amount of credit for the interception because he didn't position himself well and he didn't fight for it and he didn't compete for the ball maybe in a way that he should have. But I think that the majority of the blame has to go for Teddy Bridgewater for the ball placement and for I would call that a lack of anticipation for where the receiver should be and is going to be. To Charles Johnson's credit, he did try to turn into a defensive back with his hands. But he wasn't in a good position. Either way, you have that interception. That interception comes after a perfectly placed throw for a touchdown pass that was dropped by Kyle Rudolph. And if that touchdown happens, obviously that interception doesn't happen, which alters, I think, our perception of Teddy Bridgewater. But of course, after that, you have a dropped interception, very, very short, maybe even the next drive, if not the drive afterwards in the first quarter to the sideline. I think it was on second or third down on a rollout. And that was bad. But then he has, very shortly after that, he has a phenomenally placed deep ball to Charles Johnson. On the broadcast, I looked at it. I couldn't actually see, much of where the ball was placed. But live, I was able to see the ball, and it looked like it was in a really good spot. Charles Johnson had the ball. Defensive pass interference pops out of his hands. The Vikings get the call, and they advance, some 30-some yards because of it. And Teddy doesn't get it in his stat line, which, we both agree looks pretty poor. 13 of 24 for 121 yards and an interception. That's a really, really poor stat line. But, he has that great deep ball to Johnson that doesn't get counted. But then he throws short on third and long. And that was, I think, to Kyle Rudolph. And I remember when that happened, I said, that's such bullshit. I was really angry at the time. And I can go down the list all throughout the first half. There was there's like the time he stepped into pressure and nearly threw another terrible ball, and then there was the time that he got an amazing Wallace sideline throw. This is all still like mostly partway through the second quarter. A lot of really high highs that didn't get counted, a lot of really low lows, some of which did get counted. And I think that if you take Teddy's performance holistically, I still agree it's a bad performance, but people are acting like there aren't good spots here. And, Teddy was under pressure a fair amount. And, I don't think that's kind of an excuse here because the way he performed under pressure was poor. And I don't mean for Teddy. I mean, this is the kind of, performance under pressure that gets quarterbacks out of the league. I mean, I think it was a pretty bad performance even after you account for pressure. But you still have to, look at the amount of pressure he was under and how quickly the Vikings were trying to get rid of the ball and how sometimes that leads to checkdowns. And the game story is just a lot more complicated than Teddy played poorly. And if you're looking for reasons to be concerned about Teddy, of course you're going to find them. But if you're looking for reasons to think that Teddy can dig himself out of this hole, I think you'll find dozens of them. You'll find all sorts of reasons that Teddy's going to dig himself out of this hole, including what I thought was very, very accurate deep passing. That's just that ball to Wallace on the sideline, that ball to Johnson, that ball to Kyle Rudolph, all great passes. That pass to Charles Johnson deep in the end zone where that was an interception, obviously a terrible pass, but his deep accuracy was actually pretty good in this game. And that's one of the issues that people have. His performance under pressure, not great. He should move the pocket a little bit more on some occasions, move it less on other occasions. But I think that you take this into account and you take the statistics from the previous two games into account, and it looks like he's having a bad year. But I think a lot of people are forgetting that while his San Francisco game was pretty poor, he actually had a really good performance last week. People just seem to just be blanking on this performance from a week ago because the statistics are just not that good. But he had a great performance, especially because he performed really well under pressure, which is his forte, which is his problem in this game and in the San Francisco game, which I think is all indications that he's the kind of quarterback that you want him to be. But he's 22 and he's young, and these things happen. So I'm not really all that concerned. I can see why this game is a cause for concern, and I'm not going to say that Teddy performed well in the game because holistically he didn't. But he was really up and down in the game, and I think for a young quarterback who has shown sustained periods of really positive play, I think that that's an indication that he can bounce back from this performance. It doesn't really bother me that much at all, especially because the blocking scheme was really unusual in pass protection. Again, you didn't see T.J. Clemmings block edge rushers very often. You saw a lot of tight ends doing that. So the Vikings are still in a situation where they're in an unusual offense because of how much they distrust their offensive line. So, I mean, it's not the offense that they're prepared for in the preseason. So I think you take all of that into account, and I think that this is kind of a dud piece of data in the whole Teddy story. It's his 16th game. It's not a great game, but he's had more good games than bad, and even in this game, he had a lot of good moments.
And it's important to add that the offensive line held this game. Teddy ended up with no sacks overall. A couple of rushes, maybe a couple of hits, but overall the man was not sacked. The offensive line is doing its job and doing our mission statement. Our formula is always keep Teddy alive, and they seem to be doing just that this game. It was kind of nice to watch the line kind of hold, and even Adrian had a couple of good blocks for a few seconds too. Like he wasn't.
No, yeah. There were a lot of good moments from Adrian in pass protection, and yeah, there's a lot of credit to the offensive line in terms of preventing sacks. But I think the best piece of credit can go to North Turner for moving away from the 7-step drops he loves. Absolutely loves 7-step, offenses. It's how he designs his offenses. And he moved to 3- and 5-step games, and he stayed with the shotgun game, which is a slightly different timing and a slightly different route system and a slightly different blocking scheme. And then, I did say Teddy performed poorly under pressure, but those are the throws that, his throws were more inaccurate than they should have been under pressure. But he still got rid of the ball under pressure, and I thought he did a pretty good job of that. I think that there's a lot of credit that can go around to keeping Teddy alive, and that's going to be really, really important next week, which we're going to talk about more in depth when the next show hits.
I did read something interesting from 1500ESPN.com that the actual quote was North Turner called a season-high 12 plays out of the 3 tight end set, and an additional 15 plays with Zach Line in it. A similar game plan helped the Niners pummel the Vikings 2 weeks ago. So we're not necessarily giving up the game plan necessarily. That was also through the Reddit Minnesota.
Yeah, that's from I think Brownie and Notion or something. We'll link to it in the show notes. I saw that too, actually.
Yep, and it's interesting that they ended up going back to the 3 tight end set. It's not something that's seen terribly often, but after the success with the Lions game, we are going back to what didn't work against San Francisco.
Yeah, I think I find it kind of interesting because some of that was for protection purposes, and some of that was for setting up runs with bodies at the point of attack, and it did a better job against San Diego than it did San Francisco for personnel reasons, but also I thought Kyle Rudolph and Red Ellison both did a much better job blocking in this game, which that helps your 3 tight end sets. Pruitt has a little bit more experience, and we saw him on the field. It was interesting because there's like 2 different or a bunch of different approaches, I should say, to pass protection. But one of the approaches to pass protection is, what Tom Brady and Aaron Rodgers like to do, and to some extent Peyton Manning, which is to actually have fewer blockers in pass protection and have as many eligible receivers as possible, get rid of the ball as soon as pressure appears to one of them. They're elite quarterbacks. They know exactly where everyone's going to be in response to what coverage is. So it's a little bit easier for them to do it. But then, other philosophies have you run the ball a little bit more in order to protect the passer. That's something that Jacksonville's trying to do. And, that's something that Seattle's trying to do. And that's something that the Vikings are trying to do. All 3 of those organizations have young quarterbacks that I think have shown a lot of promise. Obviously, Russell Wilson's got a ring, and I think that he's proven to be extremely efficient, especially 2 years ago. And last year he wasn't as efficient. This year he's even less efficient. So we're going to see where that goes. But you've got these young quarterbacks that kind of need help because their offensive lines are mediocre. at times, and so the way they do that is to emphasize the running game. So that's one of them, and another one is to put bodies on the line of scrimmage. I mean, Houston's doing that to try and protect Ryan Mallett. Putting those bodies on the line of scrimmage in order to put more blockers in, to keep your running backs in pass protection in order to stop those blockers instead of deter blockers by putting people into patterns. And I think that the Vikings have proven that they kind of want to be in the second and third group where they take pressure off the passer by running the ball more and by putting more bodies in protection. But I think that maybe they should consider, and obviously the game plan worked last week, so it's or this last Sunday, so it's not as if this is a strong consideration, but North Turner doesn't like to do four receiver sets. I mean, we saw a little bit of it against San Francisco. But four receiver sets and a running back that's willing to go into a pass pattern, I think that probably ends up helping you in pass protection even more. Just because there's fewer potential points for failure, and the quarterback always has a safety valve. It creates sort of a pressure release. So I think that's something the Vikings should consider. But in this game, you're right, the three tight end sets were great because it helped run the ball, and it also put a couple of extra bodies in pass protection.
So let's talk defense. And it's hard to talk about the defense without bringing up the 91-yard pick six that was gifted to Chad Greenway. And I feel like, and most of the Norseman writers feel like that was a gift to you, that pick six by Greenway. And two things for that. First off, and I counted from the screenshot, there were no less than 6 Vikings are surrounding him when he was making his final descent. Like by the 5, he had 6 Vikings around him, which was just absurd. Like he could have walked that in, and nearly did at that speed. Like he looked like he needed oxygen at the end of that.
No, for sure. It's actually what's great when you talk about a 91-yard pick six. I mean, often they're made with a lot of speed. You remember, James Harrison back when he was fast had that incredible interception return touchdown in the Super Bowl. You talk about these other pick sixes. I think DRC had one that was 90-some yards. And a lot of these happen with faster players. You don't tend to get a pretty good convoy with faster players. You don't tend to get a 6-7 person convoy with faster players. So it's kind of funny because Chad Greenway. I mean, and he had a couple of blockers in front of him that might have been slowing him down, but I think some of it had to do with him slowing down, and some of it had to do with just this amazing convoy he had. He wasn't going to get touched. But it was pretty funny.
He had even brought up in an interview after the game that he was fine except for the last 15 yards. Like, the last 15 yards were the problem. Like, that slowdown might not have been the blocker. It might have been, oh God, I still have to go.
I still have so much longer to go.
I must climb this mountain. I must finish this task.
Well, luckily for Chad Greenway, he happens to play a position that at the moment for the Vikings, and this wasn't true 2 years ago, the moment for the Vikings, because the Vikings defense had to get back on the field immediately because Chad Greenway had the audacity to score. Luckily for Chad Greenway, he can get off the field and have the nickel linebacker, Eric Kendricks, come in and play snaps. So if anybody was going to have to run back 91 yards and get gassed by the end of it, at least it was someone who was probably not even going to be on the field on the next snap anyway. So the situation set up pretty beautifully for Chad.
And let's not forget that Phillip Rivers' pick sixes are like beautiful rainbows too. Like they're not. It's hard to be angry when you look at one of those. It's just, oh, look at, man, that is just, yep, run back for a touchdown. That just made my day. Because they
like a shooting star, make a wish.
Exactly. You feel like you have to make a wish afterwards. They're great. And I know I wasn't the only person who thought that was funny that it happened on your birthday. Dozens of people had mentioned it, I'm sure. But
yeah, my phone started, and I was getting a terrible signal in the stadium, but my phone started blowing up as soon as it happened, which means that by the power of texts, tweets, and emails alone, my phone achieved signal. I'm not even sure how that happens. That seems technologically impossible, but my phone achieved signal.
It forced its way through. Like all the Greenway stuff just forced its way through in a blitz, and it forced you to have signal. It just beamed through and went, no, you have to be mocked for your opinions on Chad Greenway.
It at least allowed me to send out a congratulatory tweet to Chad, which was pretty nice. After which, of course, he followed me. So it was a perfect birthday for me. Chad probably wasn't even thinking about it, of course, when he ran it in because he had 24 or so family members attending the game, including a number of them, one of whom was his grandfather, who had never attended a Vikings game before in their lives. So that was a pretty stunning moment for Chad Greenway for just so many reasons. So many things come together. I think for that to happen, it's kind of one of the reasons that we love sports. Just so many things like that happening all at once on a particular day. The first game that Tom Greenway ever attends to watch his grandson play. I mean, that's just incredible.
So, moving past Greenway's 91-yard pick six, which is in the
By
top.
the way, if you get rid of that pick six, and I've only watched the first half, so maybe I'll walk back this statement. But if you get rid of that pick six, Greenway actually had a pretty good game,
Even without it.
even with
Um,
that.
but if you look at the history of the Vikings, it is now in the top five longest returns for a touchdown in Vikings history.
That's great.
That's a cool little stat for Greenway. Question: Are we purely a nickel team now? There were a lot of nickel snaps and a lot of blitzes. Like it seems like we're playing more in nickel this year than we ever have.
That seems to be the case for sure. A lot of it, I think, has to do with the formations we're seeing. I mean, uh, San Diego, and we talked about this in the preview. Before the game started, San Diego had three wide receiver sets, or had their top three receivers play 131 of their 142 offensive snaps. I mean, they were in three receiver sets the vast majority of the time. They put a fourth receiver on the field very often. Their tight end, who wasn't in the game, Ladarius Green was out there a lot. So San Diego loves to spread the ball a lot more than the Vikings do. And so, and Detroit did too. And so there were a lot of opportunities to put, the Vikings in nickel based off of the matchups that they were seeing. So some of that has to do with their matchups because of who they played in the last two games. And so that's something you want to keep, you want to take into account. You can take a look at the snap counts alone for who the Chargers put out there. They got 73 snaps out of, I believe, 73 total offensive snaps for Keenan Allen. I think he was out there on every single offensive snap, which is more than any other Charger, of course, because Phillip Rivers didn't play the whole game and none of the offensive linemen did. And then you got a lot of snaps for Stevie Johnson, 64. You had a lot of snaps for Malcolm Floyd, 66. And then of course you had a bunch of tight ends who could show up as pass catchers, in particular John Phillips, who's a pretty poor blocker based off of what I saw, and so he was out into split wide a lot. So the Vikings were in nickel primarily because of the looks that they were seeing. I believe they had Captain Munnerlin out there, which is a pretty good indication of how often they were in nickel. The vast majority of the time, Pro Football Focus here says 66 of 72 snaps. So that's yeah. It's not that they're an exclusively nickel team, but they were given a lot of opportunities to play nickel, and they took those opportunities. So I think it's a matchup thing. And I think that that's something that you want to take a look at going forward. It's kind of surprising how often they were in nickel, given how often Linval Joseph was on the field. And so there's a lot of interesting 3-3-5 sets and 4-2-5 sets that the Vikings are playing with. And I think that the Vikings are playing, I don't want to say exotically, but they're playing with a lot more formation differences. I mean, Chad Greenway only had 20 snaps. Some of that, of course, is to rest him after the 91-yard run. But I mean, even Gerald Hodges only had 37 snaps. And so sometimes you took linebackers off. Sometimes you kept all three linebackers on. Sometimes all three linebackers did not include Greenway. Sometimes they did. There's just a healthy mix of all these different players. And at the end, when they were playing their backups, you had Anton Exum and Marcus Sherrills out there too. So
We wanted to also bring up we beat the hell out of Philip Rivers. Like he got hurt pretty badly during the game. He ended up going out with was that ribs or was that something else that he got knocked out with?
I think it was ribs, but I'm not sure. It's difficult to remember because I haven't watched that part of the broadcast yet, and they don't do a very good job of announcing it in the stadium.
Yeah, but Rivers ended up going out. We harassed him for most of the game, 4 official sacks, and as a stat line between the two of them, between Kellen Clemens, who The very nice Chargers fan in front of us couldn't even remember who the hell their backup was for a really long time. Like that guy you watched in the preseason.
Yeah,
Yeah. Oh,
he
the guy
ended up
who played
naming
for the
a
Jets.
he ended up naming a couple of backups for other teams, and then we both decided it was Charlie Whitehurst, even though we knew it wasn't true.
Yeah, it was like it might as well. It's probably Matt Flynn. Matt Flynn probably got signed for the
He's
day.
somewhere.
He's
But it ended up
probably.
being Kellen Clemens who ended up seeing game time.
Yeah. So, but the stat line for them was for the combination was 26 for 40 for 279 yards, and Rivers is a pretty prolific passer.
Yeah,
Rivers
and Rivers
can,
had a pretty phenomenal year last year, so
yeah.
there's no reason to downplay it.
This was a good defensive effort by the Vikings. I mean, Philip Rivers by himself was 21 for 34. Like Kellen Clemens went 5 for 6, but by the time they brought Kellen Clemens in, it was weird to watch the fourth quarter kind of unfold. And I'm kind of skipping around a bit, I realize, but the fourth quarter was just very weird to watch as Kellen Clemens comes out to play, and they just start running and running and running and running and running the clock down. Like they've just completely
Stunning.
yeah yeah
Yeah.
yeah. Our whole section, the whole stadium's like, you guys are really giving up with the fourth quarter starting? Like, really?
Yeah, and it was kind of weird. And, some of it might have been to protect Rivers, but I think in a game that was still winnable. I mean, it was clearly still winnable for the Chargers against a team that the previous year had shown some issues holding a lead.
But talk about no faith at all in Kellen
Yeah,
Clemens at that point. Just Kellen, just get us to the airport. That's all we need. Kellen, just get us down to Terminal One. That's all we need.
it was nuts how quickly they waved the white flag. And it's not like Danny Woodhead and Melvin Gordon aren't players that can break out, big runs when they want to, but they had no success against the Vikings, for the most part for the entire game. And it's probably a better idea to keep on, attacking the secondary. Not that the secondary was doing a poor job. We just talked about how they were doing a pretty good job. But, Philip Rivers had a 60% completion rate, and you have players like Keenan Allen and Stevie Johnson out there, both unusually good route runners. That you had a better job advancing the ball down the field in a more efficient amount of time than if you run Gordon. And they ended up even running the undrafted free agent rookie from last year that had a really good play, Brandon Oliver, for a while. And so it just felt like they waved the white flag, which was kind of unusual.
So, other things to note about the defensive effort, we held them to 90 yards rushing for the game. A lot of that came in the fourth when they just started to randomly get 5-10 yard like spurts here or there, just like prevent stuff. But we kept them to 90 yards. That was weird. Was it just a coaching issue, or was this just a really strong defensive effort by our front line?
I would say it's more the second than the first. I think that, and you have to take into account that the Chargers' offensive line was pretty bad. I mean, basically what we expected to happen in the game in terms of game plan back when we were talking to Kyle Posey. Basically, what we predicted would happen, that the Chargers would have difficulty running the ball because of the mismatch between the offensive line and the defensive line, and then the Vikings would do a really good job running the ball because of the problems that the Chargers have defending against the run, both their defensive line and their linebackers. That's exactly what happened, so it's not a huge surprise. But you have to give credit to the defensive line and to some extent, the linebackers for doing a good job. I thought, my favorite player from the game was Sharif Floyd. He ended up having, if you take a look at Pro Football Focus, of the four defensive linemen, he ended up having the lowest grade. And I think that's kind of a crime because I thought he had an enormous impact on the field. The kind of stuff that you typically assign to nose tackles, the kind of impact that those kind of players have and their ability to clog up lanes, redirect running backs, etc. I thought Sharif Floyd did a phenomenal job fanning Melvin Gordon and Danny Woodhead into other players, linebackers and defensive ends in particular. And I thought that he was probably the key to the run defense in the game, even though he didn't have that many statistics to point to in the box score. I thought he did a great job, not just penetrating the offensive line and threatening to tackle. But he did a great job, forcing the running back into other players, and I think that that's something. He squeezed lanes too, which is pretty important. And I think that's something that helped the Vikings, secure that running victory. But all four members of the offensive line, I think, did or defensive line, I think, did a really, really good job. And to that end, I think that the Vikings should be pretty happy with the kind of effort they can put forth in stopping the run, especially because you have a player like Anthony Barr, who's not typically as good stuffing the run. He's better as a blitzer. He did a pretty good job. I thought he did a good job, squeezing lanes and taking on fullbacks. In fact, I was actually making fun of some Charger fans on Twitter today because as I was going over the game, their fullback was terrible. I think they have an officially listed fullback. I think it's all tight ends, but they have the former Pittsburgh fullback, like David Johnson or Will David or some generic name that I don't really know anymore.
Some firsty name?
Yeah, it's like a firsty. It's a very fullback name too. So I think, is it David Johnson? Oh my God! So there's a David Johnson fullback tight end who is not the David Johnson that everyone's really excited about in fantasy right now. That dude plays for the Chargers. But yeah, no, this dude, whoever was the lead block fullback, was bad. He did a bad job, and I made fun of him I made fun of the Chargers on Twitter. To a couple of the Chargers followers that I have, including Kyle, about how bad their fullback is. And they were just like, yeah, no, he's really bad. He needs to be replaced. They might as well just not play a player at the fullback position. All four of the Vikings linebackers rocked this dude. So, I mean, which credit to them, but there's probably a bigger chance that this person is bad. I think that the Vikings defense played a good job. I think that, part of that good job is having a really good matchup. But the linebackers, I think, overall did a great job in making sure that the run game never got going.
Yep. Before we talk about some more great performances, we do want to bring up kind of a bit of an update on Xavier Rhodes. Xavier ended up landing on his head, landing on his neck in a really awkward way, and ended up leaving the game with a concussion. He has since passed the first protocol for it, so there is that. Hopefully he is able to play in Denver, or at least is able to return sometime soon. But as a result of that, we did get to see regular season play by Trae Waynes. And he did have his near pick and and they tested him right away. How do you feel that Trae Waynes did in his first real game against the team in the NFL?
I thought he did all right, which I think is to a lot of people underselling how well he did, and I think that's fair too. I talked to a couple of people, and remember, I didn't get to watch the game until late last night. I only watched the first half, so I didn't actually get to see a broadcast view of Trae Waynes because I don't think he got in there in the first half. So I didn't. I'm talking about sort of what I saw from the stands, and a lot of people disagree with me, and they're probably right. I thought he did all right, and I thought that more accurate passing from Phillip Rivers would have seen a couple more yards go his way. But that, I think, is missing the point, because I think that for a person who struggled as much as he did in the Hall of Fame game, the person who I thought did a pretty poor job at things that were functionally not his responsibility at Michigan State, but things that project well into the NFL. And somebody who, the Vikings admitted basically needed development. I thought he did a very, very good job against very, very good route runners who should, in theory, have targeted his weakness because of their quickness and because of, strength for their size, which is something that I think Waynes may be lacking. Now, admittedly, Waynes did a better job as a tackler than as a coverage defender, but that's not to say he did a terrible job as a coverage defender. The near interception that he had that he dropped, I think a lot of people like that. That, to me, was a play that, he was behind the receiver and it was overthrown and he had a chance at the ball, and I'm glad that he had a chance at the ball. But that's not a play I would grade as positively. But I think the other plays that I would grade positively were all over the tape. And so, the stop he had on Keenan Allen, the very first throw that he had, he gave up a reception. It's not a big deal because that's exactly what you want him to do in that situation, because he prevented the first down. Throughout the game, he actually did a pretty good job. The thing about Trae Waynes is, the kind of receiver he's up against is the kind of receiver that I'd be worried about. So the fact that he did all right against the kind of receiver that I'd be worried about is extremely encouraging. I think the next game you'll see a player that he's matched up really, really well against, a player who's strengths and weaknesses aligned with what Trey Waynes is supposed to be good at, and prevents exposure of what he's supposed to be bad at. If he gets a lot of Demaryius Thomas instead of Emmanuel Sanders, he won't have to deal with agility as much, because Thomas is a bit of a stiffer player than someone with like equal size and speed like Cordero Patterson. And he has a lot of speed, and that's his biggest weapon, and that's kind of Waynes' biggest weapon. Of course, you have to worry about the weight thing, but that's sort of always been a worry. But I think that that's a good matchup for him, schematically. So I think that Waynes played well for who I thought he was. I think he played well for a rookie, and I thought he played well enough for a starting cornerback in the NFL. So I thought he had an all right game. I think he made some rookie mistakes that didn't get exposed, and that's fine. I think that Waynes should be praised for his play.
And he didn't give up any huge pass interference penalties either, which was his biggest thing going into or getting out of the preseason.
Yeah, and I think he closed down on those in the final 2 preseason games too. But that was sort of the biggest question he had, because of how grabby he was in college, how grabby he was in camp, and how grabby he was in that first preseason game. So. Yeah, no, more power to him to avoid the things that I thought and some other people would have thought were his biggest worries. And again, against a receiving core that would be the most likely to draw out those weaknesses of his physical play at moments where it's not necessarily appropriate, and issues turning and running with quick receivers. So yeah, good on him.
Yep, definitely. Let's talk about some more good play. Let's bring up the play of Everson Griffen. Everson had a great game today.
Phenomenal game, and I thought that the amount of times he was asked to rush the passer instead of rush or defend the run, just purely rushing the passer, versus the amount of times he produced pressure, really, really good. He got in on 2 sacks. He had 4 or so quarterback hits. He batted a pass. He had a couple of stops. Stopping the run. Which is pretty fantastic. It's kind of weird. You take a look at the broadcast, you take a look at the play-by-play, and there was a lot of tackles that were erroneously assigned. Everson Griffen got one of them, and so I was actually kind of confused. But, it turns out he still actually did get on a number of running plays that he did a very good job on. And, of course, there's, you always have to worry about the penalty. That was his issue, 2 games ago. But I thought he had a really, really fantastic game. It was good to see, because that's who he was last season, and you kind of missed it a little bit earlier this year.
Next question for you. Is Harrison Smith the best safety in the league? Stats would have you believe that he might be.
Well, you'd have to tell me which stats would have me believe that. No, he's doing a really good job. I was talking with that Chargers fan, of course, about Eric Weddle, who is in the conversation to be the best safety in the league, along with like Earl Thomas. Honestly, actually, Philadelphia's Walter Thurman's doing a fantastic job too, and he may be in the conversation very soon. Devin McCourty as well. So among those 5 people, I think that this guy, Harrison Smith's kind of an underrated guy. You don't see him a lot. This person, he lives in Los Angeles, so he doesn't get exposure to Minnesota media, and he immediately identified Harrison Smith as one of the best, safeties in the league, along with Eric Weddle. And so it was fun having a conversation about the differences between the two, but specifically, the comparisons between the two. I think that Harrison Smith is up there. I wouldn't call him the best safety in the league right now, but he was great in coverage in the past 3 games, which is unique among the Vikings players, because I think he's the only defensive player who is good in all 3 games so far. He's been great. He's been as good as he has been against coverage. He's been even better, I think, against the run. I don't know if he's allowed, too many catches. I think if I can remember, he allowed 1, but I don't know how many targets he's had. But against the run, I would say he's been even better. It's not just that he's filling his gaps appropriately or attacking the line of scrimmage quickly enough or recognizing anything. He's doing all of those things, of course. But the technique with which he approaches blockers, he can wash people out. He can take advantage of changes that running backs have to make. And he does a very good job of avoiding, blocks from wide receivers and even tight ends. So he's been having a pretty stunning performance. If he continues to play at this level, I think that the level that he's shown in the past 3 games, for the next 13 games, I think that, depending obviously on the performance of a couple of other safeties, but I think that he's unequivocally in the conversation to be the best. Devin McCourty, of course, I think he's been probably pretty good in the last 3 games without many mistakes. And so he probably is favored in that conversation, in part because of the team he plays for, in part because of his past accolades, but also because he has a little bit more playmaking ability. But I think that Harrison Smith is definitely in the conversation. It's not ridiculous to ask if the Vikings have the best safety in the NFL.
So, who else had, as we're rounding out the game here, who else had a really great game that you wanted to mention specifically?
Well, I think I always want to mention Linval Joseph because I think that he's been a pretty keystone player for the Vikings. And he's been doing pretty well this year, and I think that he did well again in this game. Not just holding down double teams, which is of course his job, but I think that he was able to collapse the pocket a little bit, not enough to create pressure, but enough to move the quarterback. And I thought that he did a pretty good job in terms of doing exactly what I described Shree Floyd doing earlier in the podcast, which is redirecting runners. So I want to point him out. I think that Anthony Barr is someone that we didn't talk about very much. I think he had a pretty good game too. I think that he maybe had some issues in coverage, if I remember correctly. Again, haven't watched the second half, but I think that Anthony Barr did a pretty good job attacking blockers. In particular, he did a very good job, like I said, taking on fullbacks. I think that Andrew Sendejo, aside from the 2 instances where he nearly murdered Xavier Rhodes and then nearly murdered Trey Waynes, which is kind of stunning, he actually had an all right game. You probably can't ignore those 2 things because they had a pretty big impact on the game. But I think Andrew Sendejo actually did have an all right game outside of that. But Harrison Smith, phenomenal. Anthony Barr, great. Linval Joseph, great. Chad Greenway, great. It was just very difficult to find a player who had a poor performance.
Speaking of players who had a good performance, Blair Walsh. Blair Walsh, our expectations are so low that we just wanted to bring up that Blair Walsh did not miss any of his kicks at all, not even any extra points. Every single kick that Blair Walsh was made. He was money.
And now Eric Sugarman can finally give him his donuts.
Exactly. That is what needs to happen. But yeah, Walsh got his groove back, or at least didn't miss. Maybe the work on his follow through that Prefer was talking about this week was finally put into practice. But dude didn't miss. We're pretty stoked, and it feels good to not have to go to like the 5 to be in field goal range or something like that. So good on him. It worked out for him, and the team certainly appreciated it, and the fans certainly appreciated it.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, just the general malaise that the fans have had over the past 2 games in the preseason when Blair Walsh went up to kick, the general pessimism that all of us had in this game when he went up to kick. It's nice to see him make the kicks, but of course he's going to have a couple of games before he gets more than a cookie, but he gets a pass. So good on him. It's a process. He's going to have to make the next couple anyway.
Exactly. And we were just kind of laughing because we were like, oh, God, we scored. Now we have to decide if we're going for 2. Like, there were enough of those moments where we scored, like, okay, well, so what are we going to do then? But good on him. He was successful. He was able to get it to the uprights. So thank you, Blair Walsh, for getting your groove back. It seems like a little late in the season for it, but good on you. You got a couple of good kicks in you. So let's talk daily fantasy. Every week we've been giving a little bit of a daily fantasy update as far as possible sleepers or a possible strategy to try out. Once again, this podcast anything inside of it is not to be construed as gambling advice. But Arif, what are your daily fantasy sleepers for the week, and is there a strategy people should be looking at?
Yeah, I think the strategy we want to talk about this week is stacking. And it's something that people are kind of familiar with if they're in the fantasy community, and it's something that actually people like to avoid in season-long fantasy leagues. So we've talked a little bit in the past about how volatility and variability and variance can be good if you're in a contest that only rewards the top 20% of entrants, or the top 30%. So triple ups, quintuple ups, and the Millionaire Maker contests that are so popular. In those contests, you want higher variance because if you have an average score, you're not going to get, points. Whereas if in a 50-50, a double up, or a head-to-head, you're going to get, if you get just a slightly above average score, you're going to get points. So you want to reduce your variability and boost your average. But I think that in these tournament games, the people who make money are the ones who play high variance players. It's very rarely that someone ends up making money, for example, the Millionaire Maker, without playing two or three high variance players. And by rarely, I of course mean rare in the context of percentages. I mean by an absolute number, because there's so many people playing daily fantasy. There are a number of people who absolutely do play low variance players and end up with some money. But I think that the winning strategy in those games is to bite the bullet and play some high variance players. And another way to increase your variability, and it can affect your average a little bit negatively, of course, is to stack, which is to choose players from the same team or choose players from the same game. We know that in games where there's high scoring, there tends to be high passing, not just because of a backwards effect where a lot of passing leads to a lot of scoring, but a lot of scoring leads to a lot of passing because teams try to catch up. You run out the clock when you're ahead, unless you're Bruce Arians, I guess. But you run out the clock when you're ahead, and you try to pass when you're behind. And in a shootout, you tend to keep passing and you don't tend to keep running. So that's how a same game effect can happen. But a same team effect can happen too. And the most obvious of those is a quarterback wide receiver pair, where if Tom Brady scores a lot of points, there's a pretty good chance that Julian Edelman or Rob Gronkowski is going to score a lot of points, especially in those PPR leagues. So that's something that you want to take a look at. But the stack I want to look at is going to be pretty unique in terms of stacks. It's going to be this Thursday night game. It's going to be Michael Vick, Antonio Brown, and Le'Veon Bell. And you don't always have a stack with a running back in it, although sometimes you do, because high-scoring games, you get close to the end zone, the running back gets either a cheap touchdown or vulture. But the thing about Le'Veon Bell is that also he catches passes, and Michael Vick, he's a high turnover kind of guy, but over the last couple of years, he's done a little bit more in terms of toning it down and checking it down. And Antonio Brown and Le'Veon Bell are perfect for that. We saw a lot of Antonio Brown in the game where Roethlisberger went down and Vick came in. So, I think that the reason you want to play Vick is because he's cheap. He's the minimum salary, I think, in both FanDuel and Daily Fantasy, and both FanDuel and DraftKings. And then you could also play Le'Veon Bell with him, who's kind of expensive, and Antonio Brown, who's quite expensive. And if that game ends up being a high-scoring game, which a lot of these Thursday night affairs tend to be, then you could also play Steve Smith. So I think that these are the kinds of things that, if you lose, you'll lose by a lot. But that doesn't matter, because if you win by a little, you still lose in these guaranteed prize pools. So that's the kind of stack that you maybe want to take a look at this week. I'm not going to play that stack that much in my 50-50s, my double ups, and my head to heads, but it's something I'm going to be taking a look at and thinking about when I take a look at my Millionaire Maker lineups, my quintuple up lineups, and even my triple up lineups, because Michael Vick, I could see him putting together a really dud game. I could see him putting together 150 yards in the air, 30 yards on the ground, because some of his athleticism is gone, more quickness than speed. His speed is kind of there. And maybe he's not going to complete that many passes because he likes to be a high-risk guy. Maybe he throws two interceptions. But the kind of player that Michael Vick is, and the kind of preparation that teams have in Thursday night games, the Baltimore defense hasn't been good. They've been exposed by, Cincinnati, which has an all-right offense with Andy Dalton, Oakland, which has an all-right offense with Derek Carr. They've been exposed. Even Denver, their offense hasn't been world-beating. And that's back when Baltimore had Suggs. Even Denver was able to get some points on the board. And I think that a short week, they don't have the ability to prepare for a change in quarterback. And I think the Baltimore defense is hurting. So I think that you can get some cheap yards. Maybe he'll run in a touchdown. You get Le'Veon Bell to be the safety valve, and Antonio Brown, he's going to get targets no matter who's at quarterback, because he's open, and the game plan that they like to have for him is for him to get targets. Mind you, if there's one game where Antonio Brown breaks his insane streak of at least 5 receptions in a game, it's probably going to be this one. But I think a short week is favorable to a mobile quarterback like Vick and a high volatility player like Vick. So that's my advice this week, and that incorporates sort of the strategy which we've talked about, which is stacking.
So that'll be it for the daily fantasy update, and And I'm kind of surprised that everything has gone so well with the podcast and no one's burned the field or anything like in St. Louis. It's been and it was weird because I got the message about the field being on fire in St. Louis, and they sprayed the field, and the chemicals stayed on the field, so they had to like vacuum it. But I get the message about that, and no one can look it up on Twitter or anything because the service in the stadium was so terrible. So we're just sitting there just going, we don't know if the building is on fire or something, but
yeah, we were just like,
something.
so, some of the field might be on fire. Most of it might be on fire. We're not sure. And a guy two seats down from us was like, "Oh, that's why Roethlisberger has 0 points," because he was looking at the fantasy updates.
Yeah.
On the screen, which don't include the game is delayed because the field was on fire.
Which, let's be honest, I feel like they should be like it's St. Louis. They're just trying to salt the earth before they leave. Like,
yeah, right. It's like this fire may have been partially on purpose, but yeah, the guy next to me was like really worried. And we found out that the field was on fire, and he's like, "Okay, good. Ben Roethlisberger will still score a lot of points."
even Ben's tough. Big Ben's tough. He'll score even if the field's on fire. Like, he's just gonna find. Ben Roethlisberger doesn't take no for an answer. He is going to go and make this happen.
Well, he didn't, but
yeah.
he finally got on the field, and then he got in.
Yeah, he finally got on the field anyway. But yeah, the field being on fire. Like, I don't know if the field's on fire or if somebody's just meant to say the team's a dumpster fire. Like, I don't know what's going on. But nope, no fields on fire today. But that will be it for this week. If you'd like to follow us on Twitter, you can do so at NorseCodeDN. You can follow Arif at ArifHassanNFL. You can follow our other co-host, Dusty, at Dusty O'Connell. You can follow myself at Big Mono, although I do most of the tweeting for the Norse Code account. If you'd like to donate to the show and help us out, you can go to NorseCodePodcast.com and go to the very bottom of the screen and click on the donate button. You can also donate to the Patreon page, which is linked in our not only on the web page, but will also be listed on the Daily Norseman show notes as well. Do you have anything to plug before we leave for the day?
Nope. I will mention that I am ahead in daily fantasy. Last week I mentioned that I was behind and I'd lost a little bit of money, even though I'm ahead on the year. This week I got way ahead on the year, so obviously I'm always right when it comes to daily fantasy.
That is yes, we're not paid by daily fantasy sites, but Arif is taking money from them. And I feel like that's an important distinction. This isn't like was it Matt Berry, or who was the guy from ESPN that was doing his fantasy football updates and like drenched.
It was Matt Berry's love-hate, and he wouldn't stop saying the word DraftKings.
That's what it was. Matt Berry said DraftKings 1,000 times, and then his week 2 column was all about why he did it. Like, listen, they're paying me, but I really like it. Like, wow.
Okay, dude. Maybe next time you tell us that you're sponsored, and that could be a little bit better.
Yeah, maybe you can just kind of announce that, because apparently these guys just have more money than God and can like okay, well, we're just going to buy everything and anything, and your life will now be sponsored by it. It's gonna be sweet. All right, so for Arif, for Dusty, for myself, thanks again for listening, and our formula is this: keep Teddy alive, and we will see you on Thursday.
Norse Code is the official podcast of the Daily Norseman SB Nation blog and is produced with cooperation from Pompous Jerk Productions. Pompous Jerk Productions. Attitude with attitude. The opinions expressed in this podcast are solely those of their contributors and do not reflect official positions of the Minnesota Vikings, SB Nation, the Daily Norseman staff, or PJP. No information in this podcast should be construed as gambling advice. Please obey all local gaming laws.
Our formula is this. We go out, we hit people in the mouth.